Where's that darn karate Jew? They're making us robbing us look horrible.
If you've enjoyed this program, please click like and subscribe.
Shalom, and welcome again to another exciting edition of the Torah Watchman Show, LLC, available for YouTube subscribers for free. Hosted by none other, your humble karate host, Reb Ben-Emmett. I've missed you so much. Yes, all my love to my karate brothers and sisters throughout the world. There's more of us than you think. Yes, there's more. And they're growing. They're growing exponentially. Torah-centered Jews are growing more than I'd say some of the orthodoxy that's out there. There are a lot of reasons why Jews are leaving orthodoxy behind. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just saying you have a welcome home, whoever you are, Am Yisrael High, to come into a karate congregation that's near you. Unfortunately, there's only the synagogues are far in between. If you live in Israel, that's the main place where they are. Or if you would like to go to San Francisco, California, there's a karate headquarters for American Karate Judaism. They don't pay anything for me for giving you commercial advertisement. All my love to B'nai Noach as well. Listen, we have a series of parshas that are coming up. I started last week with Shemot. We're talking about the Exodus, literally the Exodus of Hebrew slaves that would have been in slavery by the Egyptian taskmasters, the Pharaoh of the time of Moshe, for approximately 230 years, more or less, okay? Now, how they got to Goshen, how they left Goshen, how they defeated 300 well-armed chariots of Egypt, Pharaoh's imperial army there. How did they defeat them? How did they survive in the desert? How did they wander as nomads and survive off of a diet of scorpions and snakes? Yes. And the seculars out there have doubted the 5 books of the Torah for a long time. They really have. In the 19th century, they formed an opinion that was pretty much set in stone in academia, and that rabbis and Jews that didn't have anything else better to do when they're in Persia and Babylonia, they were just writing up fairy tales and stories to try to glorify the nation of Israel when they were exiled into those areas of the world. And we're talking about the time of Prophet Daniel and so on. Not in the 19th century BCE. That's what I'm talking about. I was thinking this week about evidence of the Exodus story. Now, this Jew believes word of mouth, literally, the 5 books of Torah are absolute and divine. But I am a man of hard science. In other words, I understand why people believe in Darwin's theory of evolution. I believe in general tenets of adaptation, of superior species, and other things of this nature. I believe the world is much older than many rabbis speculate, for many reasons, and when I get into that. What I'm saying is, I believe Torah is not a religious book, it's a teaching book, and I believe it's wrapped in science. It's ingenious, some of the ideas that come from the Torah that's used in reference in the framers of the United States and the formation of the U.S. Constitution, really. Don't get into that. But what the title is of this Torah Watchman show is the top 10 discoveries related to Moshe and the Exodus. There will always be doubters out there. This video, I hope it would just at least open your mind to new ideas. What I'm going to provide to you is evidence, as a preponderance of evidence, like you are debating something in court, or if you're competing for your doctorate degree and your master thesis, and you have proof and theorems and things of this nature, conclusive evidence measured against empirical standard of scientific measurements. This is what I'm talking about. This is what I love. I love archaeology, and this is what we're talking about. Brief disclaimer, okay? The author here is Brian Wendell. Now, you probably heard the name of this person. I believe he's a Christian pastor. I don't know him personally, but I want to point out something that's very tragic in Judaism, okay? Not many rabbis have master degrees, PhDs, higher scientific, technical, related degrees. They just don't. They don't teach world history per se in yeshiva. They don't teach it. They teach strictly what's in the Torah and the Tanakh. That's all beautiful and sweet, but they don't go into the advanced areas of geology, of meteorology, of archaeology, paleontology, and everything else they can think of as far as the entire life cycle of the planet. How do we get here? Why aren't those ancient civilizations here anymore? Is it evidence they ever existed, or is it just fables like Greek mythology and things of this nature? Well, if you go to most rabbis out there, they understand the bibliographies of the sages and things of this nature. Rashi, Ramban, Nachmanides, and many of the others. They'll talk ad nauseum into your blue in the face about all their bibliographies, the Hasidic masters. There's dozens and not hundreds of books of these kind of things. They are not interested in any world history that's not directly impactful for the Jewish people. If it's not in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, which is believed that Ezra, the scribe, wrote some of these historical books there, they're not really interested. Who is interested? I hate to say this. It's secular, but perhaps secular Jews and Christians, evangelical Christians. Now, something I want to point out when you're trying to look for hidden treasure. You know, everyone loves Sherlock Holmes and all the detective work and Watson and all this stuff. Trying to put together clues, jigsaw puzzles, trying to find evidence that leads to something else. They can have a determination or whatever. But you know, what I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of Christian archaeologists, I'm talking about PhD scientists, very smart people, okay? It's very difficult to get a PhD at some of these more advanced fields. And these Christian PhDs, and I'm not marking them, I'm not promoting them over at Judaism. I'm talking about teaching, okay? Torah is about teaching. Tanakh is about teaching, right? Lessons, right? I'm saying is that they are excited about their findings because they believe in the Bible. They believe in their good book. Listen, they like the New Testament. They refer to my Torah as the Old Testament. I have many problems with Christians. I triune Godhead and all that stuff. But I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about science. You may be a Christian by your belief, by religious denominational construct, but it's about science. That's what I'm talking about, okay? What I'm going to be listing here is 10 proofs why the exodus or the egress of Moshe and the Hebrew people out of Egypt not only happened as the Torah said precisely, we have evidence in the 21st century that says that it happened, and it validates the Word of God. Who is not for validating the Word of God in academia and science, right? This is where I'm going. You have to have an open mind if you want to see the truth. Does God speak to Christians? Well, some Christianity does, and most of them don't listen. But you know, these people here, if anything, what they're finding out as far as the archeological digs and findings, everything I'm going to reveal to you this evening, what they're finding out should excite every Jew out there. Why are we not digging out in these areas? Some of the seculars are, but they're not using the Bible as their blueprint. What am I saying is, listen, if you want to find out where all these archaeological areas are and these ancient cities and things, where they were located as they were referenced throughout the Torah, it's in the Bible, more or less. And some of these towns and communities don't exist anymore. And the nation states of Canaanites, for instance, don't exist anymore. The Philistines don't exist anymore. We do, Am Yisrael High. But there's evidence there, and you use that book there. You have to believe that that good book is true and written by the divine architect of Elohim, first of all, before you take one shovel, one pick, one digging spade or tool to go into the ground, go back in time, and bring up that evidence. Let's get started. Okay, the account of Jehovah Elohim, Emmet, our God is true. Raising up Messiah to lead the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt is one of the most important biblical events in history. Even the Quran talked about it, believe it or not, okay? Moshe is mentioned in the Quran many more times than the prophet Muhammad. Interesting, right? In fact, it's the most frequently mentioned event in the entire Old Testament for Christian. And the context of this, it will have more appeal to B'nai Noach and Christians out there that are haters of the Jewish people, and some fair-minded Jews too, okay? I know there's some Messianics out there probably, whatever. To each their own. But please stay with me. Referred to over 120 times in subsequent stories, laws, and poems throughout history. This books of the Psalms, historical writings, sacred writings, the prophecies. In addition, there have been 3,500 years of almost unspoken Pesach celebrations based on this story, the story of the Exodus, right? And that's something else, oral tradition. If I said before, the rabbinates, oral tradition is embedded, is that silver thread throughout the entire Hebrew Bible. It really is, okay? The Exodus is such a seminal event in Hebrew history that it stretches credibility to suggest, as some critics do, that it never happened and does not have any historical basis in truth. That's where we're at, okay? So don't mind me if I flip pages here, okay? I'm trying to get through this as soon as I can, and I want to stay on script. This is not about my opinion. I'm your news reporter, per se. Yes, Rev Yara ben-Emmett. So, is there any archaeological evidence of the Israelite exodus from Egypt? Okay, I've been asking myself the question every time we have Passover, Pesach, or every time we go through this Torah cycle and we start the book of Exodus, Shemos. And I ask these questions because I'm a man of science. I have to ask these questions. I have to be well-grounded when I talk to anybody before I get into opinions, all right? So I believe there is provided one that recognizes the limits of archaeology and looks in the correct time period. So again, you take the Bible as a frame of reference. You take oral tradition, not just Jewish, but oral tradition passed through many different faiths and religions and cultures and nations over a period of time, and you bring that together as an aggregate. As far as the Pharaoh that was in charge of the slaves, the Hebrew slaves in time of Moshe, that is still debated too. Okay, there's not a lot of writing. There's no writing per se today. You can go in a museum in Egypt, you don't see ancient relics there with pharaohs admitting they were a complete failure to maintain their Hebrew slave force, and they beat their pants off. You don't see that story there. You don't see anything written about Moses. You really don't. Hence the argument of the seculars and atheists out there that it never happened. And it was the stories that were written when the Jews were called into Babylon and later in Persia. That's when they wrote the Talmud and the tractates. That's where they think they wrote the entire Torah, not the hands of Moshe. And they don't believe Moshe even existed. Here I'm at here. First one, when they do not expect to find any Egyptian inscription, things fade away. Papyrus, if something's in pottery, it could be sandblasted over a period of time in the desert. royal encryptions never included negative reports about the pharaoh. Pharaohs who were like demigods and gods themselves. They never would be the ones to brag or boast on their failures to other nations to show their weaknesses, right? If they were deities, they don't make mistakes, right? So it's very interesting. Moreover, the Israelites wandered in the desert as nomads for 40 years, and they left very little evidence there. Why? Because they lived in encampments, temporary dwellings, tents, and things of that nature, and they did not build any structures, any permanent dwellings, no brick and mortar homes, and that kind of thing, okay? So this is an ongoing problem for evidence finding. Stay with me, please. So this doesn't mean that there is no evidence of the Exodus at all. Even everything I just said, it does not mean there's no evidence at all supporting the Exodus outside of your faith that the Torah is true. Okay? It means that one needs to look for the correct things, like the evidence of declining Egyptian society, for instance. You can imagine if the entire Egyptian army was decimated and drowned at the Red Sea, just as the Torah told about, and the plagues and famine and everything else, you would think that the Egyptian population would be in a sharp decline. Not even mentioning famine and wars and things of that nature. So you look at a sharp decline in Egyptian society and culture. In other words, they build less certain time periods and wrote less certain time periods based on environmental constraints, okay? Secondly, one needs to look at the correct time period and clues of the Exodus, okay? Again, it's hard you can't carbon date something that doesn't exist anymore. Papyrus is a plant-based product, and only unless it's petrified or in a cave at the Qumran, Dead Sea Scrolls and things of that nature, it just doesn't stay together, for thousands of years. So you have to look at other sources that are more indelible, like written into stone, okay? So fortunately, the Bible gives ample chronological data relating to the event. Torah is not always chronological, but it can be sequential at times, okay? And there's definitely a leading of a sequence of events that led to the Exodus, and Pharaoh said, "Get out of Egypt, I had enough of you, leave, take whatever gold and spoils you want, and get out of here." That the 10 plagues was a countdown of sequential events that led to other outcomes, okay, both positive and negative. And also the wandering in the wilderness and things of this nature. These were a lot of sequential things. It took so much time to get to Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments, for example, okay? These are sequential events. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 says that it was in the 418th year, 80th year, after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, that Solomon began building the temple. This is chronology, folks, and this is timekeeping, folks. Someone was keeping time to state that as a matter of fact, okay? Solomon began building the temple at a certain point in time. The golden age of Solomon is well known, and very few people doubt that King Solomon existed. They were doubting for quite some time that King David existed and King Hezekiah existed. But that's been recently proven too. Not getting into that. Okay, so straightforward reading of this verse places the Exodus in approximately 1446 BCE. This time frame is affirmed by numerous and other passages, such as in Judges, generations listed in 1 Chronicles, chapter 6, verse 33 to verse 38. Thus, one needs to look in the 15th century BCE, okay, for evidence of the Exodus, not the 13th century BCE, as some scholars claim. So it's very important to look for evidence in the correct epoch of time, okay? And I would not be doing a video on this if I didn't think it was well written and well researched and was reasonably free of errors and objective biases. I love things that are, free of subjective biases. I don't like You need to be objective in your scientific finding, not subjective, opinion-based. And there's a lot of things out there that are subjective, and fortunately the Talmud is full of subjective reasoning. Here then are the top 10 discoveries related to Moshe, okay? First of all, we start with number 10 and going down. Something known as proto-Sinaitic inscriptions. What does that mean? Proto means the very first, maybe a rough draft of something, not quite matured as a language script. And Sinaitic inscription were something people, dwellers, Amalekites, Canaanites, Hebrews around the Mount Sinai chain per se, those people, those nomads that lived there, they had inscriptions over a period of time on some of the rock faces and things of that nature, okay? And I'll have pictures, and we'll have pictures here of the proto-Sinaitic inscription that is kept in a museum for evidence, okay? Some have suggested that Moshe did not write the first 5 books of the Bible, but rather they were written 1,000 years later by a supposed group of priests living in exile, okay? I've said this before, and it's true that the Babylonian Talmud talks about that period of time in which the Jews were talking about Sanhedrin, laws around halakha, around prayer and Shabbat and things of that nature, okay? But that was more the Talmud tractates and not writing in the good book, any additional books, okay? That had not even been canonized at that time. Everyone was dealing with scrolls during that time period, okay? And that's roughly, correct me if I'm wrong, I would say that as 400, 500 years ago, that time frame, okay? Now, there was no known alphabetic script in which Moshe could have recorded such lengthy reports. In fact, the Hebrews were suspected to be illiterate people. They didn't know how to write or read. Because during that time, the 19th century BCE, no one knew how to read, right? There was no evidence of encryption, then you assume that no one knew how to read or write or comprehend language other than verbal or nonverbal communication, okay? Nothing was written down. That was more advanced, and it took longer to mature in human society, okay? We know now that there was indeed an alphabetic script that Moshe could have used, and we should remember here that Moshe was a unique individual by all standards of measurement, okay? In other words, Elohim had chosen him for a reason. He was extremely smart, probably had a photographic memory. He was chosen to represent the Jewish people in Egypt as next to a prince of Egypt, you know. Literally, the Pharaoh of Egypt at that time when Moshe was a young man and growing up there was his stepfather. Essentially, he was treated as a son of the Pharaoh, as a prince per se, because he was adopted by one of the daughters of the Pharaoh, okay? So he was afforded academic knowledge, acquiescing language, writing, things of this nature, as any of royalty would. Any individual in Egypt at that time who was part of royalty, they were afforded and had the funds to learn these advanced studies that no one else had afforded. So again, I told you the Torah is a teaching book, and Moshe was a master teacher. If anything, he taught the Torah to the Jewish people, just as the Torah said. So stay with me here, okay? So, come here. Sir Flinders Petrie discovered examples of alphabetic writing inscribed in stones at the Sarabit, Il Kadim, and Egyptian turquoise mine in the Sinai, okay, in the Sinai Peninsula. They date from the 19th to the 15th century BCE. Back to the Proto-Sinaitic script, as it's often called, was invented by Semites, okay, sons of Shem. Shem was one of the sons of Noah, and then by Semites who worked in these turquoise mines as pictographic letters for their language, and they used like hieroglyphics very close to the Egyptian language. Okay, you've seen Egyptian language written on tombs and temples and pyramids and things of that nature, pictures of animals and things like that. Kanji in Japanese use pictography type language, hieroglyphics kind of language too. Okay, but that was a language of choice. And that language was the baseline that was referenced eventually among the nation states of Canaan, okay? But how the language was used is still a matter of debate, of course. Douglas Petrovich was presented evidence that these inscriptions were written by Israelites, believe it or not, and that the Hebrew is the language behind the script. So his translation of one of the encryptions, which is known as Sinai 361, contains the name of Moshe, believe it or not. Not all scholars are convinced because some of these proto-Semitic letters and characters are subject to interpretation, but there is a growing consensus that the word Moshe name was referenced in some of this script, okay? So it is interesting that an alphabetic script developed in a precise time that Israelites were in Egypt. Okay? I mean, they had to communicate with the slave masters. They had to communicate with other slaves there. There were probably Ethiopian and Phoenician slaves in that area of Egypt as well. I mean, you had to communicate. You probably had to write down notes or something. Just think about that. Okay? And the way children learn language, they copy like a parakeet. My daughter repeated everything that we said. We had to be careful what we said in our home until she understood what the words meant. Okay? Words and pictures help speed up language acquisition. Not I'll get into that too much. So there was a functional language behind the origin of the script. At the very least, we now know that there was indeed an alphabetic script that Moshe could have used to write the first 5 books of the Bible. So you see where I'm going, okay? This Sinai script, as they call it, the Egyptian language, the borrowing from the Egyptian language, and the Canaanites adding that to some sort of primitive character set, all of this. In other words, Moshe indeed had access to written alphabet of his time to construct pages of annals, chronological content, which literally eventually led to the writing of the Torah. Okay? Number 9, Egyptian words in Hebrew text. You heard me right. Okay? So the Egyptian word for the Nile, Great River, and I've heard this one before, represented by these hieroglyphs, literally ITRW and waters determinative. In other words, the word river in the biblical account of baby Moshe is not the normal Hebrew word for river, nahar, okay? But rather a transliteration of the Egyptian word. Very interesting, right? Yes. The Hebrews during the time of slavery did speak Egyptian, and they mixed and they probably blended in some of their native tongue, whatever they had tribally speaking that was handed down from Abraham, from Mesopotamia, the Chaldeans and people of that nature coming down, and language, that's how language is acquired. They transliterated one language set to another language set that was useful. For instance, the language of Yiddish uses Hebrew alphabetic characters, but the soundings are like the German language when spoken. Okay? I thought that was interesting. So one of the most often overlooked elements of the Exodus account in the Bible is the use of Egyptian works in the Hebrew text. Okay? After the birth of Moshe in the narrative we read, when she could hide him no longer, okay, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and dabbed it with bitumen and pitch, in other words, tar. She put the child in it and placed him on the reeds of the river bank. This is Exodus chapter 2, verse 3. Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer, I apologize for pronouncing any of these names incorrectly, has highlighted the numerous Egyptian words that are often missed in this verse. Okay? The Hebrew word for basket is tabat, or nan, okay? And derives from the Egyptian word dibjit, I believe, dibjit. Similarly, the words bulrushes, continuing on, and pitch have Egyptian etymologies or origins, okay? And the Hebrew word for reeds is unquestionably the Egyptian word of Tefy, Twfy, when it's transliterated in English. The word river, clearly referring to the Nile, is not the normal Hebrew word for river, nahar, but rather a transliteration of the Egyptian word for Nile. Even Moshe's name is Egyptian, having been given by Pharaoh's daughter. Okay? So Moshe is not a Hebrew word. Newsflash, because the name was given by an Egyptian daughter, Pharaoh's daughter. Okay, I thought that was fascinating. So Hoffmeyer writes, there is a widespread agreement that at the root of the name of the great Hebrew leader is the Egyptian word Misi, M-S-I, Misi, which was very common element in theophoric names throughout the New Kingdom. For instance, Amenmose, Thutmose, the Egyptian pharaohs, Ophmose, Thamos, Ramos, and Ramses. You can see how these words have similar vowels and soundings, okay? The Egyptian loan words in Hebrew texts are difficult to explain unless one acknowledges Moshe's Egyptian education and authorship. Goes back to that outstanding college work and academia that Moshe had access to that the Hebrew slaves did not, and none of the common folks. Only unless you were among the priests of Egypt or among the royalty of Egypt, you were not afforded access to higher education. Okay. Now, number 8, there's something called Papyrus Brooklyn. And this is very interesting. It records the names of 95 household slaves, okay, including some that are Hebrew. And this is in the Brooklyn Museum. I've never been there. Central to the Egyptian account is the presence of the Israelites in Egypt to begin with, okay, establishing the presence of Hebrew slaves in Egypt during a certain epoch of time when other things were happening. Okay, so the Bible describes Joseph's entrance into Egypt as a slave. Genesis 37:28, his rise to power in Genesis 41:44, his initiative in bringing his family to Egypt, as recorded in Genesis 45:18, their subsequent growth in Exodus 1:7, and their eventual bondage, Exodus 1:11. Some scholars, however, do not believe the Israelites were ever in Egypt. And I've heard this before. Okay, for example, in 1999 article in Haaretz, Ze'ev Herzog boldly declared, this is what archaeologists have learned from their excavations in the land of Israel. The Israelites were never in Egypt. Haaretz is not a very mainstream conservative Jewish newspaper. It's run by liberals. It is what it is, okay? I don't read it. But anyway, it's interesting to see what's on the other side of the coin, okay? So you heard that dynamic statement. They were never in Egypt and never wandered in the desert. So I guess we were Cabbage Patch kids and we grew up in a Cabbage Patch. I don't know. Maybe Jews fell out of the clouds. I don't know. No. My wife has an atheist cousin, and we get into discussion about this kind of thing. Everyone comes from something. Everything has a point of origin, right? Unless you believe in the Big Bang Theory, and just like blowing up a bookstore will produce a clean, beautiful hardback or leather book as a result of all that explosion and randomness. It's just the way it is, okay? All kidding aside, the Egyptian document written in hieratic script names 95 household servants of a nobleman named, get this, Senabitzi. 40 of the names of Semitic Hebrew is a Semitic language, and several have been identified as Hebrew names. You heard me right. These include Menahema, a feminine form of the Hebrew name Menahem. You can find that word in 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 14. A woman whose name is a parallel to Issachar, one of Yaakov's sons, Genesis 30, chapter 30, verse 18, and also parallel in Shiphrah, the name of one of the Hebrew midwives prior to Exodus 1:15, okay? To be clear, this papyrus dates the 13th dynasty, okay? This is 1809 through 1743 BCE. That's before Common Era, okay? Just after the time of Joseph, and does not refer to Hebrew slaves at the time of Moshe. Titus Kennedy summarizes the papyrus important. This is something I have a picture of, as it was preserved for all posterity in a very dry, like cave or environment where oxygen or air was not exposed to it. Okay, it's an amazing, miraculous find. This list is clear attestation of the Hebrew people living in Egypt prior to Exodus, and is an essential piece of evidence in the argument of the historical Exodus. Or you can deny that this papyrus inscriptions and writing and Hebrew and Egyptian names that are referenced here to these slaves here, you can deny that exists, even though you see it in a museum. Okay? Maybe it was falsified. You know, who knows? Okay? Number 7, the Egyptian records of slaves making bricks. Okay? We heard that lovely story. We've seen it in Charleston has Ten Commandments. You know, the Pharaoh loved to make the Hebrew slaves make bricks, all the clay and walking in the mud, using straw and everything else, making bricks, making mortar and everything else for all the big building projects that Pharaoh liked to brag about, you know, all the sphinxes and statues and other things of this nature, pyramids, you know. Egyptian slave force, not just Hebrews, were responsible for all these building projects, okay? But how was this done? And where's the evidence and the time in which these bricklayers occurred, okay? So one of the tasks the Israelite slaves were pressed into making bricks, just like I said before, Exodus 5, chapter 5, verses 7 through 8, when Moshe petitioned Pharaoh to let God's people go. Remember, Pharaoh ordered the Hebrews, okay, I'm not only letting you go, and as punishment for daring oppose me, your Pharaoh, you will make bricks without straw, okay? Making their labor from difficult to impossible, essentially, very miserable. Okay, Exodus chapter 5, verses 6 through 18. The biblical description of slaves making bricks is affirmed by a painting in the tomb of Rechamar, dated 1470 through 1445, plus or minus BCE, a long time ago, okay? So the vizier of Egypt under Tutmos III and Amenhotep II, remember the last name there, the painting depicts and demonstrates Nubian and Asiatic slaves. Egyptians called the people from Canaan Asiatics. Okay? Now you heard that. Making bricks for workshops of Karnak temple. In other words, if the Egyptian armies invaded Canaan and they won, they would take that nation of people into slavery and add to their workforce. Okay? You'd also take bits and pieces of their language and create a alphabet soup or a melting pot of different cultures. Okay, how to add that. Okay, So the slaves were collecting and mixing mud and water, picking the mud in brick molds, and leaving bricks to dry in a hot sun. Nearby Egyptian officials, each with a rod, would oversee the work. Okay. In addition to the Rockmeyer tomb painting, a lever scroll in the Louvre that dates to the same time of Ramses II mentions 40 stable masters or junior officers who each had a quota of 2,000 bricks to be made by men under them. Who were these men? Two further Egyptian papyri, the word Anatasi, the fourth and the fifth, record that there are no men to make bricks and no straw in the district. They could not find people to do this. And Egyptians certainly wouldn't damage their cuticles and get dirt underneath their fingernails, right? All kidding aside. Highlighting the importance of straw as a binder in the brick making, okay? So there was methods and techniques here in making the right brick that would not fall to pieces once you assembled it under weight. So as well as the dismayed Israelites would have felt when Pharaoh stopped supplying it, but it still required the same number of bricks. Remember, the quota would not change. That's in Exodus chapter 5, verses 18 to 21. Now, Egyptian records affirm the biblical description of the process of making bricks. This is not in debate. Bricks were made a certain way back in that time. Okay? Number six, discoveries of Avarice. Okay? You can look at the picture here behind me, the city of Avarice beneath the city of Ramses. Behold this image here. According to the biblical text, the Israelites settled in the land of Ramses, okay? That's the large area there divided with Goshen, okay? Genesis chapter 47, verse 11. Sometime in the 19th century BCE, that was the consensus there of both, I would say, rabbis, religious leaders, establishment, and archaeologists and scientists who do all these wonderful digs and discoveries and everything else, okay? So while they were initially free, at some point they became slaves in the native Egyptian, and they were pressed to building the city of Ramses. Remember, approximately 230 years, more or less, after the death of Joseph, this is when the new Pharaoh rose into power and said, we need to do something about all of these Hebrews here. They're out of workers, whatever, and we need to make them slaves and put them to work. Give them something to do. Give them something to be proud of, right? Yeah. Go home to your wife and say, you know, I met the quota of 1,000 bricks today, honey. Whatever. So when they left Egypt in 1446 BCE, some 430 years later, they departed from Ramses. Again, that 430 years is a dating record used by Rashi that goes back to the first prophecy that God made to Abraham, that eventually the Hebrews, his progeny, his ancestors would be in Egypt as slaves. Okay, that's what that 400 year is. And some people say that the Jews were enslaved as slaves in Egypt for 400 years. That's not true. Okay. But approximately 230 years after the death of Joseph is a better number. Okay? So the use of the word Ramses is an update of the biblical text of a later editors to replace an archaic place name with one that was more recognizable. So in map making, okay, words change. Words and phrases change, the way it's transliterated change. For instance, Syria of Philistia, that Emperor Hadrian renamed in 135 CE, Judea, eventually became known as Palestine. And the map makers changed the geographical location of these nations and everything else accordingly throughout the ages, okay? So then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them possession of land in Egypt, in the best of the land of Ramses, and Goshen was a small section of that total real estate. as Pharaoh had commanded. It does not mean that the Pharaoh in power of the slaves at that time, the day of Moshe, was named was Ramses, okay? So number 7, this picture here, represents the Palace F and Palace G from ancient Avra's date to the time of Moshe. Again, if you can find Egyptian artifacts, pharaohs entombed, mummies and things like that, and date them some way, some rocks and some minerals have radioactive isotopes, okay? When you have a mummified body, sometimes you have a carbon footprint of that. They can date that too, because carbon has a unstable isotope there that has a decay over a certain period of time, and literally you can check your watch about how much time has transpassed without getting into more science here. Okay? Now, thanks to 5 decades of excavation by the Austrian Archaeological Institute of Cairo at Tel Dabra in the eastern Nile Delta, we now know that this was the site of the city of Ramses, okay? Which was itself built over a previous city named Avras. Remember, ancient cities are lower than the more contemporary cities, and you build them up. The city of Jerusalem is built on top of an older Canaanite city named Salem. Okay? That's what I'm talking about. So, while the site is the most famous as the Hyksos capital, it was originally settled in the 19th century, the time of Joseph, by a group of non-Egyptians from Canaan, as evidenced by Canaanite pottery and weapons. Yes, you can date that at the same time that the Torah says the Jews were in Goshen, Egypt. Okay? See where I'm going? There is even evidence of a 4-roomed house in the village, the same layout as houses typical of Israelite settlements and later Iron Age. Okay? Yeah, during the Iron Age, you literally had the development of iron, primarily from meteorites that had iron ore within it, to make swords and weapons and tools and things of that nature through metallurgical processes, okay? As well as a prominent tomb in which the remains of a statue of a Semitic man with a multicolored robe was found, okay? The town grew and became more Egyptianized, with a mansion built atop of the 4-roomed house, which some believe to be the residence of Ephraim and Manasseh. Interesting, right? Joseph's sons, of course, they were considered elite. The sons of Joseph, who was second in command to Pharaoh of that time, we don't know his name, they had rank and privilege, and they lived in special homes, things of that nature that other people were not benefited to. Okay? The palace precinct was later built at Avras during the Hyksos period, and then, or epoch, and expanded during the 18th century, forming a new royal citadel. This later palatal complex dates to the time of Moshe and is likely where he spent time when he was raised in Pharaoh's courts. Isn't that remarkable? Is that remarkable? Okay? Interestingly, the excavators at Tel El Dab noted that the site was suddenly and mysteriously abandoned after the reign of Amenhotep II, suggesting that a plague may have been the reason. Yes, the Pharaoh that was over all the Egyptian taskmasters, was over the Egyptian army that pursued the Hebrews across the Red Sea and attacked them and tried to destroy them and bring them back, was none other than Amenhotep II. Okay? More to come. So evidence may be of a plague. You look at people, decline of society and population, where you can see footprints of people that actually lived in a certain area, and then you can see, date that, and then you can see evidence when there were no people there at all. Like Pompeii, when that volcano went up, it wiped out an entire population and civilization of people. Okay? It took a long time for people to come back into that area. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay? The excavations at Tel Adab have revealed the presence of an Asiatic community who first settled the pastoralist, then grew in number as well-to-do entrepreneurs. Okay, they became subservient to the Egyptians and finally left. This scenario exactly matches what we read in our Bible. Okay, so you read the Bible as one data source or multiple data sources of evidence. On the other hand, you look at other evidence and ancient history that has no religious context per se, but ostensibly it's archaeological, okay, in nature and scope. It's science, okay? Something you can measure against a laboratory standard. Number 5, evidence of Amenhotep II as the Pharaoh of Exodus. Boom, 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 the climax is here, okay? I have a picture here, okay? 19th dynasty Pharaoh Amenhotep was once part of a Sphinx. You got that, the beautiful Sphinx face. That statue, we have the bust of that in a museum. It is currently housed in the State Museum of Egyptian Art in Munich, Germany, of all places, okay? Numerous scholars have identified Amenhotep II as the Pharaoh of Exodus, okay? He was reigning in 1446 BCE when the Israelites left. That's very close to the chronology recorded in the Torah. Amenhotep the second is known to have spent considerable time in the Delta region, likely in the 18th dynasty palace at Avras, that ancient city, okay, which later on was renamed Ramses, okay, where he would have met Moshe at some point in time. So according to Egyptologist Charles Alling, Amenhotep II was born and raised in this area, the now Delta region, built there, had estates there. His architectural footprint, just like King Herod, built things that we can date today, the stones and bricks and everything else, and in all probability resided there at times, at least at his early regnal years, okay? Interestingly, in keeping with the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, Amenhotep II was not the firstborn son of his father, okay? And that was Thutmose III. That is not problematic. That is decidedly to be true by most group consensus of scientists, okay? Nor was Amenhotep's son, Thutmose IV, his firstborn son, okay? So just take that in jest. Another piece of evidence for identifying Amenhotep II as the Pharaoh of Exodus is found in comparing the military campaign of Amenhotep II with those of his father. While Thutmose III led 17 known military campaigns in the Levant, the Middle East, Amenhotep II led only 2 or 3, very small in comparison. Why? Maybe he lost soldiers. Here we go. Thutmose III boasted of having taken 5,903 captives on the first campaign, while Amenhotep II claimed to have taken 2,214 captives on his first. However, Amenhotep II's final campaign in the 9th year of his reign, that was approximately 1446 BC, appears to have been a hasty and limited excursion into Palestine to take 101,128 captives, to say, I did something, Father, you know. One plausible explanation for this campaign and its dramatic number of captives is that he was seeking to replace a large portion of his slave labor base that had just left Egypt. According to the Torah, approximately 600,000 people, the head count of fighting-age men, were comprised the number of Hebrews in Goshen that left Egypt. Okay? Which I think is fascinating. Moreover, Amenhotep II never took another campaign into Canaan. He didn't. And in the 18th dynasty began to decline in power. Exactly what you would think when the Pharaoh in charge had his entire army decimated and nothing to brag about. Okay, the Seti War relief. Now, we're talking about that. Picture right here is Seti I returned from his first campaign of victory in the relief from the north wall of the Hypostyle Hall in Karnak Temple of Amun and Luxor. First time I heard these words. I hope you like archaeological things and findings in history. I hope you do. Okay, all of this is in books, and you can go to museums around the world, in the Middle East, Egypt, and Germany, maybe in the U.S., and see these artifacts here. The famous relief of the campaigns of the pharaoh Seti I, this was 1291 to 1279 BCE, okay? At the Karnak Temple depicts the eastern border of Egypt in a pictorial form, like a map, which is very useful, okay? Because you didn't have a lot of maps that lasted over the centuries, thousands of years from that time. And like it relates to the route that Moshe and the Israelites took during the Exodus. Very interesting. So in Exodus 13:17, we read, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, for obvious reasons, although that was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds, and then they see war and return to Egypt. Okay, God understands human nature. The Seti relief painting, mural, depicts this road, known as the Horus Way, as well as a number of fortresses, including Tisru, the staging point for Egyptian campaigns into Canaan. I believe this is also known as the King's Highway. I'm not sure. You can correct me if I'm wrong. A vertical waterway lined with reeds and labeled the dividing waters is visible, as well as a larger body of water at the bottom of the waterway, a feature that has been seen by early explorers but no longer is visible. Okay? The Seti relief is evidence that there was at one time in the distant past a canal and waterway on the eastern border of Egypt, even though the area is a desert now. This has been affirmed by geological studies that have demonstrated there was indeed a man-made canal joining a string of lakes between the Gulf of Suez and the Mediterranean Sea. Why is it important? These canals and lakes from the El Bala lakes in the north and Lake Timsah to the Bitter Lakes in the south. Okay? Remember bitter waters that the Hebrews encountered in the desert, formed a defensive barrier on the eastern frontier of Egypt. The Bible says Moshe led the Israelites through the Red Sea. Okay, in Hebrew, Yam Suf means Red Sea, literally Sea of Reeds, okay, which may correspond to the wetlands and lake systems, Egypt's Egyptian border, okay. Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer, the scientist again, has matched Egyptian place names with the location mentioned in Exodus itinerary and suggests that the Yam Suf, the Israelites' cross, was likely in the area of El Bala, okay? And that has been a recent change in what was previously believed. And if you have a Christian Bible, you may see older version maps that point to different routes, okay? Now we're going to talk about the Solev encryption, okay? Rounding this up. At the photo here is from J. Lagalant Les Folles de Solev, okay? Again, these are all very fascinating relics that was recently interpreted because we have access to AI and computerized technologies to be able to decipher ancient languages, okay? The Solev encryption here, Malahatap III names the land of Shasul, nomads of Yahweh. You heard me right. As a place he claims to have conquered. Coincidence? I don't know. At the end of the 15th century BCE, the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III built a temple in honor of the god Amun-Ra at the Solev in Nubia. Okay, you've heard that name. Modern-day northern Sudan. He had left a list of territories he claimed to have conquered on a series of columns in the temple. Okay, each territory depicted by a relief of a prisoner and with his hands tied behind the back over an oval name ring, identifying the land of conquered of the foe. Why is this critically important? Please stay with me. One of the enemies is from the land of the Shasul, which means nomads. That's Egyptian to refer to the word nomads of Yahweh. The Hebrews were nomads in a foreign land that did not belong to them, that they were traveling through, okay? Given the other name rings nearby, the context would place the land in the Canaanite region. In addition, the prisoner is clearly portrayed as Semitic, okay? Maybe the nose, I don't know, or the bridge, the brow, and everything else. Rather than African looking, as some people may have said, as other prisoners on the list are portrayed. So for the mix of different races of slaves there, okay? So the encryption clearly references Yahweh in Egyptian hieroglyphics, the oldest such reference outside the Bible in existence. And second, around 1400 BCE, Amenhotep III knew about the god Yahweh. Moreover, Celeb encryption would indicate an area in Canaan in the 15th century BCE inhabited by the nomadic or semi-nomadic people who worship the god Yahweh. Even the Israelites and Midianites in the time of Jethro, remember he was talking about the god of the mountain, Mount Horeb, okay? Maybe that's discussing that reference point, I don't know. So Charles Alling and historian Clyde Villington summarize, if the Pharaoh of the Axis had never before heard of the God of Yahweh, this strongly suggests that the Exodus should be dated no later than 1400 BCE, because Pharaoh Amenhotep III had clearly heard about Yahweh in his time, 1400 BCE. Okay, the Berlin pedestal. This is one of my favorite, and it's probably a fairly new one, okay? Berlin pedestal is from Egyptian Museum in Berlin. Why does Germany have everyone's artifacts? I don't know. Okay, it has three name rings. The one on the far right has been reconstructed to read Israel. Okay? The Berlin pedestal is an Egyptian inscription housed in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin that almost certainly refers to Israel as a nation and Canaan. The inscription has three name rings, two of which clearly read Ashkelon and Canaan. Sound familiar? Okay. And the third of which has been reconstructed to read Israel. Okay. And the spelling and transliteration is a little bit different. Okay. In a recent re-examination of the inscription, Peter van der Veen, Christopher Theus, and Manfred Gorg noted that the names of Ashkelon and Canaan largely were written consonantally and better reflect examples of the reigns of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't have Egyptian college. 15th century BC. Then those from the times of Ramses II and Amenhotep century. That's 13th century. They're not time frame. So while the encryption reads Israel instead of Israel, the spelling is Israel. Okay, very close, right? Except one letter. There is no other candidate near Canaan and Ashkelon other than the biblical Israel. That's not. Okay, process elimination, I guess. It may be that the sh sound, okay, spelling is an older way the Egyptians spelled Israel. Quite possible, right? Our language has changed in a period of time, okay? So has Hebrew. I mean, if you gave a book of Hebrew today in the 21st century, went back in time and gave it Moses, he wouldn't be able to read it. It's that different, okay? But the context is the same, okay? So this interpretation is correct. It would indicate the Israelites had migrated to Canaan sometime in the middle of the second millennium BCE, exactly at the time the Bible said. So it coincides the dates, okay? The Memphis stele, okay, is a 10-foot tall granite victory monument that names Israel as a nation in Canaan. Okay, are you convinced yet? The most famous and arguably the most important discovery related to Moshe and the Exodus is the Memphis stele, okay? correct me if I'm wrong, I think an Egyptian farmer or someone found this, and he would repurpose it for something. I'm not sure what, maybe for sheep or cattle or something. And then once he realized, or someone else, he talked to people about it, discovered it, ended up in a museum. Okay. In 1208 BCE, Pharaoh Merneptah erected a 10-foot tall victory monument called a still, okay, in the temple of Thebes. You've heard Thebes before, right? To boast of his claims of victory of both Libya and Canaan. It was discovered in 1896 by Sir Flinders Petrie, the Merneptah boasts Israel is wasted, its seed is not, and Huru or Canaan has become a widow because of Egypt. Okay? The inscription likely refers to a small campaign into Canaan. Only 3 cities were taken, and despite Merneptah's boast, Israel was not destroyed. Of course, he would not be bragging on a nation of slaves, incompetent, non-militarized slaves, that with his pants off. Okay? That's not how leaders write their legacies, like to be remembered. Most scholars agree that this is the oldest definitive reference in Israel as a nation outside the Bible, and certainly the clearest Egyptian reference to Israel, period. Okay? It's also important because it points toward an early date for the Exodus, and not the late date that some scholars hold to, 1446 BCE. Okay? It is doubtful that there will be enough time from 1270 BCE to 1208 BCE to account for the Exodus. Okay, the 40 years of wandering in the desert, the 7-year conquest of Canaan, and the settlement of the tribes and territories, and the establishment of a national presence of the land, all before the Merneptah claims to have conquered the Israelites. Okay, the Merneptah's Canaanite campaign instead likely dates to the time of the Judges. Okay, when the nation of Israel was already settled in Canaan. Interesting. The Merneptah still is evidence from Exodus from Egypt, led by Moshe, took place in the 15th century BCE, as the biblical data indicates. In conclusion, okay, here we go. Let's do a home run right here, okay? Thank you for your patience. Taking it all together, in our conclusion, these 10 discoveries indicate that the accounts of Moshe and the Exodus are based in real history. I mean, in a hard granite stone still, in multiple sources. You find 1 or 2 sources with some rough encryption, things that are translated about 100 different ways. Yeah, it's kind of dubious. But it's a consistent pattern of evidence here. It really is. And I'm taking through just 10 of these major discoveries. Okay? While not the proof beyond the shadow of the doubt, like in court, okay? You cannot send someone to death, to death, capital punishment, without a reasonable shred of doubt. There's always doubt, and it actually helps in more objective reasoning when you do investigations, right? They provide a circumstantial evidence. Some people can be convicted on circumstantial evidence alone. That can lead one to reasonably conclude that the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt at the time the Bible indicates, okay? Further, the archaeological data suggests that the Israelites left suddenly and were settled in Canaan by the end of the 15th century BCE, okay, in line with the biblical data. And I'm out of pages. Are you convinced? Really, I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm not here to persuade you to follow a certain truth that I love myself. I brag on myself. I hang on my wall. I got murals of myself that I am the best and most knowledgeable Jew around. No. I've read you other people's evidence, other people's reporting, and yes, there were Christians that offered some of this paper and put together. They have YouTube videos and everything. You can watch that. Listen, it talks about archaeology, it talks about ancient history, it talks about evidence and finding evidence and using the Bible as a litmus test to base these arguments upon. Well, I hope this has been a blessing to you. I hope it's been enlightening for you. I hope it encourages you to go and Google it yourself. I will share the link in this YouTube video when I publish it. God bless you. Shalom Aleichem. Reb Yaar ben-Emmett signing out until the next time. I hope you enjoyed this documentary. I try not to do everything religious all the time, but I hope it meant something to you. God bless you. Reb Yaar ben-Emmett signing out.